not the truth of what's happening. Paul also gave this example, or this analogy of a car and how we're supposed to take a sledgehammer to it. He's right that the off-case arguments we made didn't take a sledgehammer to it. They're instead saying that brand new shiny car you got is actually just a junker. It's not actually what you really think it is. Specifically, he has not actually given any concrete examples of how these people are, who they are who are going to prison. I want each and every one of these people here to think about it. Do any of you actually know a person who's been arrested for possession of marijuana and sent to prison for that, just for that crime alone? Yes. Not for the people. How long are these people who are sent to prison? They're probably not sent for a long time. It's probably for a person who's having prison. What happens as well? It happens. What happens with these people as well? If they're arrested, they get sent to prison, as normally as well, because there are other crimes they pleaded down from, there are other charges against them, there are other good reasons for it. Now I can give you specific examples as well. When Paul reads the evidence, he says how 75,000 people were arrested for possession. That may be right, they're arrested for possession. The ones who are actually sent to prison just for possession is a very, very small number. But in those cases as well, it's usually for very good reasons too. I can give you a couple examples of this. First of all is the case of Donovan Adams. He's an example commonly cited by marijuana legalization advocates. What they talk about is how he was a casual marijuana user. He got 66 months in prison for selling pot. Now that's technically true, but he was an example of the concurrent sentencing we talked about. What they don't mention is that he got 60 months in prison because he had an illegal automatic weapon, but he got 6 months concurrent as well for possession. So technically, he went to prison for possession. Another example as well, talking on the plea bargain ones, is Seth Ferranti. He was arrested for pot near St. Louis and given 24 years in prison, all for possession is what people tell you. What actually happened is he was running an LSD network and had sold over 100,000 doses of the drug. But he took the plea bargain down and took possession. He got sentenced to prison for that. And so he's not in prison now for actual possession of marijuana, but for running a drug empire. The reason they have to do this is because it's hard to make other charges stick. But making possession charges stick is easy. Getting people to plead down to possession is easy. It's not something like other crimes where you have to try and prove a whole bunch of other things with it. It's just, did you have the drug on you? Yes or no? If you did, you can go to prison for it. There are other instances as well where they need to have possession charges in order to be able to actually get people to prison. A common example actually is domestic abuse. A lot of times, people who are domestically abused are afraid to testify against their spouse for obvious reasons. What happens though is when the police are in there, if they see marijuana, they can connect to that person. That person can then get charged with possession, regardless of whether the spouse is afraid to testify against that person or not. So there's important, valuable reason to have these possession charges stick around. Now, Paul makes a couple arguments as well about how the opposite of drug policy is biased. First of all, he doesn't actually contextualize that into how people, or into how this argument is actually skewed somehow. There's a good explanation for why it is that there are so few people who are sent to prison just for possession alone. He says that the harms are still real, and that's true. There are, of course, some people who are sent to prison for possession, but it's minimal compared to what the people who are actually sent for other crimes as well and for other reasons. The last argument he says as well is that even it can help some other people, and that's true. There may be some people benefited, but that's what the importance of our other one about rushing into policies that we're not actually prepared for is about. Now, on that argument, we are still only 2 years in to legalization in Washington and Colorado. We haven't actually seen the full range of effects of what's going to happen with it. It's been a bit of time, but there's not nearly been enough time for actual studies of positive and negative health effects that come around from revenue, from things like that. Instead, we are seeing this as well only tested in a small number of states, and you're not seeing this tested on a national level for the United States, which is the important part as well. There are plenty of times we've rushed into policies without actually thinking through all the consequences of them, even ones with good intention. Examples like the war in Iraq, we ran in without complete information, trying to do good, and instead we ended up making things a whole lot worse. There's a great example as well of what happened with the government of Victoria, Australia. They actually went and tried to, they required all people who were bicycling to wear a helmet when they do it. That had the opposite effect, though. A number of children who didn't want to wear helmets decided to stop bicycling and instead began walking. The net health effects that happened from that, of more children walking rather than biking and exercising, was worse for the actual overall public health because they were going and they were walking rather than getting better exercise from bicycling. And so when we don't have these fully thought through policies, we can have serious negative consequences that result from it as well. And the last example he gives as well on this argument is that we do actually have the experience. Paul is right again. We do have some experience with legalization on this in these few two states, but we don't actually have the whole nationwide example or the way of being able to analyze this effectively, which is what is important for this. He also tries to make the argument as well about how there, even if we save a few people, well, that's maybe true. There will be some benefits to it, but there are still significant harms, which we talked about on the case examples, things like cartels shifting over to human trafficking, or the actual monetary cost will come back as a result of us not being able to effectively regulate and force people to actually buy legalized marijuana as opposed to going through the illegal networks they still have that exist. And that is it for me. I'm good for pressing.
Hi, John.
Hey, Paul.
How was your plane flight down here today?
It was really early. Thanks for inviting me to 6 a.m. for me.
Yeah, you're welcome. I think the plane flight back's at 5 a.m. Let's talk a little bit about this whole statistics question that you talked about.
Sure.
And you talked about Donovan Adams. So my question is, if I admit that Donovan Adams is in prison for solely weapons charges, in reality, would you admit that there are some people there who are probably there just because of pot?
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
But the thing is, I've actually given examples of how this gets skewed. You've just asserted it and not actually said, yeah, here are examples of this.
Yeah, that seems like a fair trade-off. Why do you have a problem with used cars? You said a car's only under. What's so bad about you? I kind of like a nice used car right now. I don't know about you. Let's talk about this delay thing, because I'm really more interested in that. I'm not quite so interested in the whole statistic manipulation thing.
Right.
So let's say that we decide to accept the negative position that we should wait, and that maybe the audience is sort of thinking, well, maybe that's reasonable. So what is the negative position? How many years should we wait? 5 or less?
Well, I think we should wait first off until some actual, good studies have come out from it. There's been a few preliminary ones about the effects, but there's not been enough to come out to have a good overview of what the actual effects have been of marijuana legalization in these states. I think once that happens and we get a better perspective, then we'll be able to actually, devise some national policy based on it.
Okay, well, when we think about waiting a few years at 10,000 people a year, are there any of the arguments that Taylor makes when she talks about the health stuff and the productivity stuff? Is there any of that she can quantify and give us some actual numbers that's going to come anything close to the numbers we give you in terms of 10,000 people?
What do you mean? Like what numbers?
Well, I mean, she talks about how the health that's bad for you.
Yeah, that was a response to your argument about there being more money as a result of legalization.
My question is the negative at any point in the debate going to present any evidence that's going to say a cartel shove or a healthcare problem is going to add up to those types of statistics that Matthew gave us in the 1AC?
Statistics about money, or the statistics about people going to prison?
Let's go with life. Yeah.
Okay, well, no, we haven't read evidence specifically about the number of people. We're indicting as well your method of collecting statistics. And you keep throwing this 10,000 number, but again, you don't have actual examples of the people who are going to prison just for possession. And we're giving reasons why. Most of the people going to prison for possession are going for other crimes.
Well, now let's remember the 10,000 are corpses. So what you want is for us to give you actual narratives, specific examples.
Well, again, and also, the claim as well that the people suddenly violence is going to dry up and cartels are going to pack up and go home because we legalized pot is obviously not true. These people are the vicious, thugs you're talking about. They're going to do anything to get a buck. They're not just going to give up. They'll find other criminal means like human trafficking.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks.
I'm going to talk about their cartel's advantage, and then I'll talk about their economy advantage, and then their justice advantage. What do we decide, 5 minutes?
Yep.
Let's start off by talking about this cartel's advantage that the affirmative has been reading. Now, they say that by legalizing marijuana, we would cut the profits of the drug cartels and be able to destroy them. But this is simply not true when you look at the evidence that the negative has presented. Now, we say that they won't be able to stop black markets because people will still continue to buy from illegal sources. Now, they say that their evidence takes this into account, but according to the Department of Justice, even many of the suppliers that they say would legally supply marijuana will be likely to get their sources from cartels because they want to avoid government regulations. This means that they're not actually able to get rid of any of the cartel's profits because these companies will continue to buy from the cartels in order to avoid government regulations. Now, they also say that drug cartels want to be rich, and so they're already doing what they can in terms of things like human trafficking. But if they're right about taking profits extent that they would if they weren't making money from marijuana. Now, either they're already diversified, as the affirmative claims, which means they're not actually fully focusing on things like human trafficking because they're focused on drug trafficking instead, or they're not going to be weakened by legalization because they're diversified, because they're already making profits elsewhere. That means that in either circumstance, they're going to be focused more on human trafficking post-legalizing marijuana because they're going to have either more resources to focus on them via not focusing as much on marijuana, or they're going to have to make those profits up. Now, they say that taking away marijuana profits would destroy the cartels, but if they're right that the cartels are diversified, marijuana profits aren't enough of their profits to actually destroy them. Now let's talk about their economy advantage. Now, they say that about 60% of people will use marijuana bought from illegal sources, but the other 40% will switch over to legal sources. However, marijuana is easy to grow at home. It's easy to buy from dealers, and buying from dealers avoids things like taxes and government regulations. This means that the vast majority of people are still going to continue to get marijuana from sources other than dispensaries. And as I mentioned on the cartel's advantage, even dispensaries are likely to get their marijuana from untaxed sources because they want to avoid things like government regulations. This means that they're not actually going to bring in any new revenues by legalizing marijuana. Also, they ignored our argument about DUIDs. People who were caught driving under the influence of drugs significantly increased after the first 6 months of marijuana legalization in Colorado and Washington. Empirical evidence shows that legalization is dangerous and will increase public health risks because people will drive under the influence, which will increase the number of accidents. This probably means that they won't be able to solve the economy, and it also means that there will be more violent deaths through things like drug-induced anger. Now, they say that we don't have any evidence or statistics for public health, but an increase in smoking will obviously increase things like asthma and bronchitis. Paul says that cigarettes are worse than marijuana, but the reality is, even if cigarettes are worse, that doesn't mean that marijuana is good for your lungs. Now, also, even if there isn't an increase in smoking-related health risks, the increase in driving accidents related to marijuana use is going to cause an increase in public health costs anyway. Now, also don't forget that there will be an increase in things like, don't forget that there will also be a reduction in our national revenue. In fact, our National Drug Intelligence Agency evidence says that $193 billion per year will be lost. They haven't mentioned this evidence or talked about it. It says that things like increased public health costs and increased accidents will be the cause of these problems. They also didn't answer our argument that they don't retroactively overturn previous drug convictions. This means that there will still be people in prison who have been convicted previously for marijuana-related charges. They aren't going to be able to reduce the cost of correctional facilities because of these people that are already in jail. And they're not going to be able to do anything for these people in terms of justice either, which is where I wanted to go next. Now, they say, they just sort of concede our argument about not being able to stop people from drug testing, and they say that a change in the mindset will change this. But they don't have any evidence that says that fewer people would drug test applicants as a result of legalization. And also, waiting to see the statistics is more likely to change people's minds. If we wait until there are longitudinal studies done in the states where this has already been taken care of, we will be able to more effectively convince people to stop drug testing than we will if we make a rash decision. Now also, they talk about the Bill of Rights, but all of their evidence is very generic to the war on drugs. It's not specifically about marijuana-related charges. Also, Paul hasn't given any specific examples of people having things like being denied a lawyer. So this evidence is not very good. Now also don't forget that they can't solve police racism because there are all other things that the police will do. They say this takes away one important tool, but that doesn't matter because the police will just find another tool to discriminate. The marijuana convictions are just a manifestation of the racism, not the underlying cause. For these reasons, marijuana shouldn't be legalized now, but we should wait and see what happens later.
So I apologize, I'm not as fancy of a speaker as these people, so we're just going to hit these one by one, bullet point lists, really quick and simple, not going to take too much time. about how shifting about how we cut off marijuana from drug cartels, they'll shift to other areas. I just want to read 2 quick points from our evidence. This first one is from Carpenter 2011, and how it says that cartels depend on U.S. revenue now, and that legalization will solve for this. It says the only lasting effective strategy is to defund the Mexican drug cartels. Reducing their billions of dollars in revenue requires the United States to abandon its failed prohibition policy. The move would eliminate the lucrative black market premium and greatly reduce the financial resources that cartels have available to bribe the officials or hire enforcers, or to kill competitors and the law enforcement personnel to intimidate the Mexican people. A refusal to abandon prohibition means that Mexico's agony will likely worsen and pose a significant security problem to the United States. And then second, we're going to talk about from American from 2011. It states that eliminating the marijuana market share of Mexican cartels would hit them especially hard because it serves as a steady, reliable source of income and carries reliable little risk for them to use. Even the most conservative of these estimates, roughly a fifth of revenue would strike the blows to the cartel's profits if eliminated. Marijuana is particularly valuable to cartels because they control the entire production line and they both grow and distribute it themselves, making it more reliable and less risky. I think it's fairly fair to say, even if they had to refocus all their resources into other things, which they already are putting resources, we cut their revenue by 1/5. That's an immense amount of money that they wouldn't have towards putting towards anything. Second, so they talk about how the DUIs have will increase because of this. We want to remind people, DUIs wouldn't be legal in this new system we would have. Driving under the influence always has been and always will be illegal. We don't say that's a good thing. They say that if we legalize it, there will still be people in prison for marijuana because of being arrested for marijuana. Yeah, that's true, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and do anything about it. Every year, we say that there's 700,000 people arrested for marijuana charges. That could drop substantially. We may not get people out, but we're certainly stop a lot more people from going in. I believe they tried to say, jokingly, no one who here has ever had a friend arrested for marijuana. Can you raise your hands again? That's quite a few people in the audience, and have that expanding throughout a lot more people. That's quite a few people. Okay, so they keep saying, they keep on throwing out all these sources that I can't remember what they say, because I'm going to go ahead and let Paul cover this, because he's a lot better than me. Thank you.
So the first argument that was just made is about how the cartel is depending on U.S. revenue now. That argument as well is talking about the entire war on drugs and not just marijuana in particular. Marijuana, as his own evidence says, is about a fifth of the revenue for it. However, as Paul himself said earlier, and we agreed with, cartels are diversifying at this point already. As he puts it, they're already so hungry for money they'll do anything, which means even if you take away the pot money, there's still going to be violence, there's still going to be human trafficking, there's still going to be all these other bad things, and you will not stop it just because you take away a small amount of the money that they have available. On the DUIs part, he's correct, Matt I think is correct, that these are still going to be illegal. The problem is you still have a lot more people driving around high, which is going to obviously have bad effects, people crashing, killing other people, and doing all the kinds of bad things. Now, on the actual ones of not overturning previous convictions, yeah, that was kind of stupid of me to ask people to raise their hands and everything. I should have known that people would have been arrested. However, the point still stands, though. There's still a large number of people who, when they're arrested, it's simply because it's tacked on charge into other more significant charges. And in the overwhelming majority of cases, most of those times, people don't actually get sent to prison for marijuana. Or, if they do, it's only more significant charge against them. The example we gave as well is the person who was arrested for rape and assault. He would get sent to prison for 20 years and 1 year extra tacked on as a concurrent sentence. Would still mean that this, he's in prison for marijuana, which means you should take every single statistic they say with a very large grain of salt, because at the end of the day, it's very difficult to tell which are true and which are not, and they've provided none other than these generic examples and these numbers they're throwing out there based on this very flawed method. Now, on the actual economics argument for this, there's little argument made about how the money, people are still going to continue buying on these illegal markets. Alcohol is legal, but there's still lots of moonshining. Tobacco is legal, but there's a surprisingly large illegal tobacco market as well in the United States. Marijuana is not going to be any different. It's a lot easier if you can work with the dealer for years to keep going to that person, as opposed to driving out to the brick and mortar store, paying the tax money, paying the extra that you're going to have to pay for them to actually own a physical store and everything, having to go through the whole process, IDs, all that kind of stuff. You can just sit at home and have someone deliver it to you. There's not going to be this giant economic windfall we're talking about, and things like the increase in DUIs are going to significantly cut into the profit of that. Now, the last one is the justice argument. This justice argument just does not make sense when you look at the realities of what actual changes we can bring around. Yes, you may take away one single tool of racist police officers, but when officers are literally shooting people in the streets because they didn't obey their every word, that's a problem, and you're not going to be able to fix that by just taking away one very small tool of theirs to be able to, cause these problems. He also talks as well about how we're shredding the Bill of Rights. Paul is still not able to give an actual specific example of a person who was denied a lawyer or any other way of having their property or their rights taken away from them. He did give the example of how they can theoretically seize your house and they can seize other property of yours, but you are allowed to go back and contest that in court and get your property back. I don't know what the actual harm is well of going and saying, no, I did not buy this with drug money, because that's the assumption of them taking it. If you're able to actually prove you bought it through legitimate means and you aren't a drug dealer, you can get 100% of your property back. Now, in the last part, 2 arguments we made about statistics and the delay. I've already explained the statistics ad nauseum, I think, of why these are skewed, how there's other ways that they're juked off by the people who are pro-legalization advocates. But again, on the actual rushing part of it, rushing into policies when we do not have a good actual idea of what the effects are going to be has just had terrible results historically, both in terms of domestic policies and international ones. There's very little harm considering most of the people who are arrested, as I said already, are sent to prison for other reasons besides marijuana possession. Most of these charges don't stick at the end of the day. Instead, what ends up happening is that we don't actually have an effective understanding of what will happen to these policies when we try and implement them, because we just don't understand it. We need to have the time to look at it and be able to understand the effects that will really happen over a long period of time in states as opposed to just 2 short years. At the end of this as well, it really comes down to the question of, do we take the plunge right now or do we wait a little bit? Considering as well, we can see some very likely possible harms and the minimal things will be solved by the switching over to legalization of marijuana. It seems better to wait a little bit longer in time to see what will finally happen to it as opposed to jumping headfirst in. Thank you.
Well, thank you all for joining us as the final speaker in today's debate. I'm going to review the arguments and indicate to you why we still think we prevail on the question of whether we ought to change our prohibitionist policy. I would begin my rebuttal by noting that we sort of talked about this imaginary car when I started the second affirmative constructive speech. I think that when we're done with this debate and we're ready to leave, we're going to actually be able to take that car and drive it away. And since all 4 of us on stage happen to be 21 or older, we're going to be able to use that car to go enjoy a frosty beverage, since that's actually legal in this country. I want to begin with the negatives argument about we should just delay, we should just wait, and we should just see what's happening. Because as I was listening to the other rebuttalists, I was over here sitting thinking about that, and I actually got a little bit angry about that argument. And it actually reminded me of the old U2 song, the one, how long must we sing this song? So my question to the negative really is, how long do we have to keep doing the things we're doing if you look at our contentions? The first contention on economics. How long are we going to continue to let $40 to $100 billion go to the cartels instead of go into our government funds? In terms of justice, how long are we going to continue to let people be railroaded in court because we effectively ignore their rights against self-incrimination? We ignore their rights against unreasonable search and seizure, and we take their property, and we give an extra tool to the police to use for racial profiling. How long are we going to continue to tolerate that, just so we can wait and see if maybe something in the experiment in Colorado or Washington will go wrong, even though we know it hasn't in the first 2 years? And then in terms of our third advantage especially, how long are we going to continue to allow 10,000 lives in this country a year to be snuffed out by the war on drugs? And remember, that evidence comes from a federal judge who has spent his life enforcing these drug policies. So the question to the negative is, how long should we continue to tolerate these things just because there may be some unforeseen consequence we haven't thought of yet? And I think that takes care of the delay argument. In terms of the statistics argument, we agree right off the bat. It's possible that some of our numbers are a little bit off. It's hard to calculate those numbers. But remember, in response to this, we came up and presented you with the evidence from Professor Bender, who isolates it to only marijuana cases and says there's 750,000 people, new people in this country, impacted every year. So, maybe it's not 10,000 lives, as I remarked in my first speech. Maybe it's 9,000. That's still a compelling reason to get rid of failed prohibitionist policies. And then if you look at the arguments against our three advantages, I sort of asked myself one question, and that was, if I were to stand up and just concede all of the arguments that Jonathan made against our advantages, all of the arguments that Taylor made against our advantages, would you still have a compelling reason to think that we ought to get rid of prohibition? And I think the answer is yes, because of the quantification. On the economics, they just sort of pick around at the argument. They're like, well, it won't be so many people, and what about this question of DUIs? And we don't change DUI policy. If you're driving while stoned, that's still a crime, and we have no problem with the police busting you for that. But they ignore the evidence we present that says it'll put $40 billion into our government's pocket every year. They ignore the evidence that Matthew reads in the first speech, where he talks about things like our own governor here in Florida is cutting education and cutting health care and spending money to put people in jail simply for marijuana possession, and what a misguided, failed policy that is, and how simply changing prohibition, simply changing the legalization policy can begin to reverse that trend. I think the justice argument is probably most compelling. And they say I don't really give you any examples on forfeiture, but we cite the law to you, and we explain to you that the way the law works is that if they find you in possession of marijuana, any property associated with that, they can immediately seize. And so, even if you have a house and you have a car, they take all of that away, so you can no longer afford to pay for a lawyer. And it's also noteworthy that they only pick on that point. They ignore arguments about the Fourth Amendment and the other amendments, and how those are eroded. We agree that legalization will not solve all racial profiling, but we think it's a moral imperative, as Matthew said in his first speech, that the major tool they use, the best, most effective tool they have for racial profiling and racism is the prohibition of marijuana. And we at least take away one tool, and if that only helps a few thousand people a year, that's still a compelling reason. And of course, finally, the human lives. They're right, I didn't do a great job about answering some of their arguments that, well, maybe inhaling marijuana smoke is bad for you. Maybe some people will die in car crashes. But the reason I don't spend much time on those arguments is they can never demonstrate to you that they have anywhere near the magnitude of the statistics that Matthew presents to you in his very first speech. We know that prohibition has always been a failure in this country, and it always will be. And so at the end of the day, we still feel that the affirmative wins the ballot and supports the proposition. Thank you. Well, my partner in crime for this event, Anna, will ask me to sort of start to wrap things up, and I think she'll have a few words for you when we're over. The first thing, before we see if the audience sort of has questions or wants to talk, is I wanted to thank my colleagues that took on this task, Matthew Johnson for joining me, so I didn't have to do the affirmative side by myself. And in particular, I think we should give a round of applause to John and Taylor, because I think they clearly had the harder side of the argument to make, and I thought they did a real good job trying to make that argument. And so at this point, we're obviously around, and we can chat with you about the debate afterwards, but if anybody has a question or comment you wanted to make for the audience as a whole, this would be the time. Anybody? Yes, sir.
Hey, if anyone needs to register to vote, You can go back here and get registered. Medical marijuana is on the ballot this year. You have 1 week left to register, whether you're for or against it. Thank you.
Any other general comments? Okay, Annabelle has some closing comments for you. And again, UCF Debate was delighted to participate in this, and we thank all of you for being here. Annabelle?
Just real quick before everybody leaves, I just want to say thank you for coming out to this. My job is to get you guys educated, and hopefully this was one of the ways to do that. On top of that, if you guys like the topic or you guys just like food, I'm having a lunch and learn on October 29th with the League of Women Voters, and they're actually talking about medical marijuana as one of their topics. They're talking about 3 different topics, and medical marijuana is one of them. So if you guys like food, we're getting catered by Qdoba. It's in the student union. If you guys want more information, feel free to ask me about it, or feel free to go on the Volunteer UCF website. And on top of that, we're having a voter registration drive tomorrow in front of the student union between 11 and 1 p.m. So go out and get registered to vote, or you can get registered to vote back there. And one more time, just going to give them a round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.